Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. I've been meaning to do a solo episode on US politics for some time now, but every time I sort of have one written up, events overtake me. So I've been through several drafts at this point. I was going to, for instance, do a solo episode on the Trump trial, but then the Supreme Court impeachment ruling dropped and kind of forced me to revise everything, and by the time I'd done that, we were sort of into this Biden drama, and then events overtook that as well. I've also been working on another project. I've been working on it for almost a year now, but I'm getting closer, not close, but closer to having it done, which is going to be a YouTube history series, which has been a phenomenal amount of work, and I hope to have some teasers to share with you on that in the next few months. But it's something that I'm excited by and hoping to share with you. It's just been a huge suck on my time, so that has meant that episodes for this show have been a little bit more infrequent. I'm still going to totally keep up with this show. I have some guests booked, there's other stuff I want to do solo episodes on, but I think it's going to be a sort of infrequent thing of, when I have good stuff to share on this channel, and I'll keep you posted with respect to other things I may be bringing out. Maybe not shortly, but hopefully at least this year. So, US politics. I've been through quite a few drafts for this solo episode, and at some point I just gave up and thought, you know what, it's been a while since I did a Q&A, so I just put out a social media call and I said, are there any questions specifically on US politics you'd like me to take a crack at? And people got back, got some really good questions, and I recorded me answering some of them. So, yeah. Let's get straight to it. No guests this episode. This is just me taking your questions on US politics. So this is USA Q&A. Okay, audience questions episode, US politics edition. So I've got some questions. I'm just going to run through as many as I get through. And I'm just going to give you, this is going to be like a casual conversational episode. I'm just going to give you like my first pass on all of them. So not really like a scripted thing, just here's my first thoughts. So first question is a great one to start with. What the hell is going on? Yeah, no, this is a fair question. We've kind of had everyone sort of locked in and seemingly not a lot going on for a bit. And then, Jesus, over the last month or two, just everything's popped off, hasn't it? So let's maybe do a quick review of some of the things that have happened. If you have not been following politics, here's what happened in the last season of America. So maybe going back a bit, Trump got criminally convicted in the hush money case. This is in 2016 when he paid illegally, and we can say that now, not accused of, but he illegally falsified business records and to pay Stormy Daniels off $150,000 to conceal an affair. Through Michael Cohen, he was convicted beyond all reasonable doubt on 34 felony counts, so that's a thing that happened. After that, there was a Supreme Court decision saying that Trump has a sort of broad immunity for official acts, so really can't be prosecuted. It is unclear how that will impact the conviction he's already received and the sentencing that he's set to receive from that. What that immunity decision has done is it's meant, this was already looking like it was going to be the case, but it's meant that the other criminal trials that were proceeding against Trump for election interference both at the state and federal level, and for concealing that he had classified documents from the FBI. It's very unlikely that it's not going to be the case now that we will see a trial on any of those before the election. After that, there was our first presidential debate, which was a lot earlier in the sort of campaigning season than usual, and this is something that Biden's team had pushed for, and boy did that backfire on them. It was grim on both sides. There were answers both Trump and Biden gave that were just flatly incoherent. Trump did his with a bit more confidence, and because I think the media is very, very hostile to Democrats right now. You know, we got a few news cycles of fairly dry coverage about the conviction. That Biden had a, to be fair, very bad debate, generated a month wall-to-wall news coverage of sustained advocacy for him to drop out, which he eventually did, and was replaced, not as president, he hasn't resigned, he's still the president, but as Democratic nominee for the upcoming election by his Vice President Kamala Harris. I'll admit, and, I hate pundits and commentators who sort of make bad predictions and then never mention them again. I admit I was a bit sceptical about this. I didn't really have a strong preference between Biden or Harris in many ways. I think Harris is clearly the better candidate. I was very sceptical, as I said, of the role the press played in this. And I'm not talking like Fox News, I'm talking like your CNNs, your New York Times, of like how hard they campaigned against the Democrats for like having a nominee who's really freaking old, versus how reluctant they've been to do the same, or just refused to do the same, against just everything Trump has done and said and continues to say and believe. I was also sceptical because there was this idea at the time, thankfully we have not done this, about having like an open convention or a mini primary or something, and I think those were cuckoo land ideas. I think those would have been a disaster to try and improvise a mini primary on the fly, or to try and do an open convention, which is something that we haven't done in 40 years and is just not something the party is set up to do anymore. But thankfully we didn't do any of that, and Harris seems to be doing pretty well. We've gone from a polling average that was tied at the time of Trump's conviction to -3 for Biden at the height of the pressure on him to drop out, to now +2 Harris. So she's not only recovered the lost ground, but seems to have added on top of that, which is very, very positive. With that said, we're still basically tied in the swing state polling. It looks like the Republicans having an electoral college advantage has not gone away. Might have been abated somewhat, but it's not gone away. So if the election was held today, it'd be basically 50-50. And it wouldn't surprise me if there was a moderate 2 or 3 point polling error in either direction. If Harris overperformed a bit or if Trump overperformed a bit, given how chaotic everything's been, given how literally unprecedented, there is just no precedent for any of this. There is no precedent in modern American politics for an ex-president running again. There is no precedent for them doing so with a felony conviction. There is no precedent for a sitting president dropping out at the last minute. Even LBJ dropped out much earlier than this, and that was a long time ago now. There is a precedent for running a female candidate. There's not a precedent for running a woman of colour. This is just we're so what the hell is going on? That, and we are in terms of like our ability to sort of confidently game out what will happen, we are off the edge of the map here. Like, this is very much uncharted waters. So I would say it's looking more positive for Democrats now than it did a month ago, but it's still very much too soon to confidently say what will happen in this election. Next question. What is now specifically at stake in this election? Is the threat from Trump and a Republican House/Senate as clear and present as it ever was? The subtext of the question is how much, if any, of the threat is overcooked. You'll, long-time listeners will know my position on this. I think there's kind of been two schools of thought on this, which don't neatly adhere to any chunk of the ideological spectrum. I've kind of taken to calling them alarmists versus anti-alarmists. People who say Trump really is dangerous, he really is sort of an existential threat to the functioning of liberal democracy, and people who say, come on, you're panicking, you're scaremongering, you're ginning it up because you support the Democrats and you want to make it as big a crisis as possible to get people to support your team. And that, look, Trump's kind of weak, isn't he? He didn't really get any of this stuff done. I've always been very much on the alarmist side. I was in 2016, I was throughout the Trump presidency, and I still am now. And I think what I'd say for the alarmist side is we've basically been right at every single point. Like, the anti-alarmists didn't think Trump could win. He did. There was a constant accusation of scaremongering about the Supreme Court, that we would, with more Republican justices appointed, end bodily autonomy for women, really completely unregulate corporate power, and gut the ability of the administrative state to do anything to constrain that. And all of that happened. Trump did attempt a violent coup in order to stay in office, and all sorts of other stuff besides. I would actually say the stakes are higher now, and it's more dangerous now than it was in 2016. I think with regards to Trump's fight to illegally maintain power after his election loss in 2020, I think I really don't agree with the narrative that, well, he failed, therefore there's nothing to worry about. I think what I would very much, particularly in retrospect and in hindsight, view that as is... So there's a military phrase which I think captures this quite nicely: reconnaissance in force. Reconnaissance in force is, to put it very simply, you find out what the enemy positions and enemy capacities are by attacking them. The Russians liked to do this in the Eastern Front in the Second World War, when, as military history nerds will know, Germany sort of had a sort of better equipped army, but there were a lot more Russians. They'd often start by just sending a wave of troops out and seeing what happened. And that sounds callous and kind of stupid, but it's actually a pretty good tactic in certain scenarios. You, one, might not know where the enemy positions are, but two, there's the human element to war. Like, neither side can quite predict in advance which troops are going to run away or panic or hold their ground or do something bizarre once the bullets start flying, right? You kind of need to stress test a system before you can work out where the key points are to hit to bring it down. And I very much see the election override attempt as something like that. Whether they meant it as that or not, I'm not quite sure, but I think it's clearly served that purpose for them. No one's ever really systematically attempted a sort of legal coup in that type of way before. And I think what they did is they kind of just sent a wave of troops forward. They threw everything at the wall to see... By the way, if you can hear seagulls in the background, I apologise for that. They are absolutely losing their minds over something. So, yeah. But they, and you had Rudy Giuliani at the Four Seasons, landscaping business, talking absolute nonsense. You had all of these different court cases talking absolute nonsense. You had protests, you had obviously the big violent riot at January 6th, you had this idea of using the vice presidential powers, you had him bullying key state lawmakers. And I think what we found there is where the weak points are. It's these key administrative positions, Secretary of State positions, people on local election boards, who kind of proved the key points that stood up to this. And since then, they've been making very sure to try and get all of them replaced with sort of party men. I mean, party men is too kind, with terrifying, deranged zealots. You have Project 2025, which is quite a big, complex, like 900 pages legal document, but it's essentially outlining how we do this better next time. I think the other learning you'll have is a lot of the key positions in the first Trump administration, Trump put Republican sort of party apachics and generals in charge of. He quite liked his generals. And I think he thought that having military men would be good because that would help him do the coup. I think there was a lack of realization to which the American high military command has a value system. It might not even be a particularly liberal one, but they take their oath of office to the Constitution seriously. I think, and they talk about this openly, from day one, you will see the key positions going not based on sort of you're standing within the Republican Party or like, a military career or anything like that. I think you'll see them going to people who are personally loyal to Trump, who they think they can count on to break the law for them. You'll also have a presidency empowered by this immunity decision, such that essentially he can't break the law while in office. Now, Republicans say now, oh, don't be silly, the immunity decision doesn't mean that. I guarantee you they will turn on a dime when in office to say, oh, don't you realise we have this immunity decision and anything the president does is definitionally legal? And all of this will be in service of a very, very right-wing, very authoritarian agenda. I think we are absolutely gearing up for a national abortion ban. I think they are going to go for contraception. The modern Republican Party are weird, and they are obsessed with stuff like this. I think they are absolutely looking to transition us away from competitive elections. And the final point I'll add as consequences to this election is foreign policy. I think if Trump wins, then Ukraine and Palestine will functionally cease to exist. I think it's not at all clear that under a different administration, Ukraine would not have fallen already. I think the Ukrainians are doing heroic work in resisting a very, very brutal and cynical invasion. But clearly, American support is making that resistance possible. And I think it's definitely the case that Trump will try and stop that support once he gets into office. I think the sort of foreign policy establishment, the so-called deep state, will try and stop him. I'm not sure they will be able to. I think he very clearly does not care about Ukraine and is sympathetic towards Putin, and let's not forget that was his first impeachment was over this, right? When it comes to Palestine, I might do a whole episode just on this, but just staying with Trump, I think there is definitely... Okay, let me just say this much. I think there is definitely a desire amongst the most far-right members of Israel's cabinet, possibly shared by Netanyahu himself, but certainly floated by the far-right elements, that the entire population of Gaza should be driven out of the Gaza Strip and into the Sinai Desert, and that Gaza should be annexed and resettled. So true mass ethnic cleansing. Is what has stopped that some internal resistance on Israel's part, or is that the America and a democratic administration have made it clear that, we support Israel, but that would be a red line for us? I don't know. I think possibly the latter. Trump, in his own words, said, quote, "You have to finish the job." I think in Trump you would have a president who would greenlight something like that. I think you would have a president who would not apply the types of pressure on Israel we have seen vis-a-vis not expanding this into a regional war or allowing humanitarian aid through. And I think, you would very much be risking true full-scale annexation. That's pretty grim, I know, but I think that's the likely outcome there, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that Trump is the most pro-Israeli president we've had in the modern era. He's the only one, I think. He's the only one, even from Republicans, who hasn't paid at least lip service to the idea of a two-state solution. So I think that could be very, very dangerous. So the future of Ukraine, the future of Palestine, as grim as those situations are currently, I think do have the potential to get a lot worse with the wrong person in power. So all of which is to say, both for liberal democracy at home, for some of the very unpleasant conflicts we have around the world, and for just sort of not living in authoritarian state, I'm on the alarmist side, and I think the danger is greater now than it was in 2016. And that's, I think, just a fairly sober assessment of the facts and of what Trump is telling us he plans to do. So, Next question. How are Republicans hanging on electorally with the absolute freak show the party has become, and how did it become such a freak show? We are not that long when we had normal people like George W. Bush and McCain. Will they have to pay the piper eventually? So I would say, I think, it's such a big question and there's so much to say here. I mean, I do think they are paying the price already. It's just not as much of a price as we would want them to pay. I think if the Republicans ran someone normal in this election, they'd be ahead by 10 points. Like, it wouldn't even be close. There's a lot of frustration with the Biden administration, some justified, some, I think, unjustified. And I think just generally worldwide, like, we're living in a very sort of anti-incumbent age. Like, people are really frustrated with, I can't think of an incumbent government in the world that has a positive approval rating, at least not among, like, developed democracies. So I think, like, the Republicans should be doing really well right now. I think Trump should have won election. I mean, should, not morally, but like a normal Republican would have won that election. And I think a normal Republican would have won comfortably in 2016. So they are paying an electoral price. It's just not a big enough one. And I mean, maybe there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one thing to just keep in mind here when you think, well, how can people look at this and think this is in any way okay or normal, is they're receiving their news very differently to you. If you watch, like, Fox News, much less if you're getting your political news from right-wing commentators online, it'll be very, very curated. You won't be hearing Trump got convicted on 34 counts. You'll be hearing Democrats weaponized the justice system to push these trumped up charges against Trump. I actually did that one unintentionally. So people are just really living in completely different realities, completely different media systems. So that is something to to keep in mind there. There could be a whole episode really sort of breaking down that question of why Trump's support has proved so resilient. But I would take that as a starting point. I'd also take as a starting point, a lot of Americans have very right-wing beliefs, and a lot of, both on policy and just sort of general vibe and affect, people find Trump appealing. They're not. He's not being presented to them in the same way as he's presented to you, and they don't value the same things, and they don't see the same things in him. Next question. What is it about the US system that means third parties can't even get a foothold? There are third parties in the US. You've got something like the Working Families Party, who I used to work for, actually, which is a sort of lefty third party. Now, that's definitely helped by different structures like ballot line voting or ranked choice, which sort of make a third party make more sense. I'd also say even at the national level, it's not, a third party hasn't won the presidency, but they often, in 2016, third parties got, I think, 6.5% of the vote. Until recently, RFK was polling at about 10% in this election. And I think Ross Perot got up to 19% in 1992. Like, it was a big chunk of the electorate went to him. I think third parties have just not been very good at building up sustained infrastructure. Like, it's not the case that a Perot or a Nader has really attempted to build the infrastructure to make to sort of take those flashes in a pan and make them permanent. And they haven't been interested in it. The Green Party has really just not been interested in building state and local foundations. They sort of will field a candidate at the presidential level, I think really explicitly as a protest vote. So more broadly, the classic answer here is that the US electoral system is not friendly to third parties, like a first-past-the-post system. It's very tricky to have a multi-party system under that. Whereas, say, if we had proportional representation, maybe you could have a multi-party system. I'm actually not as convinced by that answer as I used to be. The UK has a first-past-the-post system, and we have a quasi-multi-party system. We have third parties. There's all sorts of different regional parties and local quirks, and all sorts of different parties serve in Parliament. There are, to put it mildly, also problems with trying to force a multi-party system through a first-past-the-post structure, but, And it's also the case that countries with proportional representation, often all the different parties sort of settle into just big blocks. So like in France right now, you used to have a million different parties, and you still kind of do, but functionally you have the centre, the right, and the left. Just blocks, or the centre-right, the far-right, and the left. Germany, too, they kind of coalesce into these coalitions. And I think also with America, it's just kind of like a path dependency thing. Like, our politics and our political instincts and people who want to run for office have just been rooted through one of these two structures for so long now that that's just kind of not just the institutional setup, but like the mental setup that we've been operating under for a long time now. Like, I think if you had proportional representation in America, it wouldn't change that much, other than that the Senate would be a bit fairer. But I think you would get just a big right-wing vote. I think you'd get a big sort of centre-left vote. I think you'd get a smaller left-left vote. But then once in Congress, those representatives would just ally, and you'd sort of have two broad coalitions anyway. And then, you get a handful of libertarians and stuff, but I'm not sure how meaningful they'd be. So yeah, I also think One thing is just the US parties have been quite good at maintaining these very, very broad coalitions. You know, if you have a if you want to run for office, and whereas in another country you might be a third party, you have open primaries in America, so it makes much more sense to get involved through a party than against a party. I think you could do the work of building a third party. I think people who talk about that tend not to do the work, and I think, you can just influence the parties through a primary, so that's how it tends to work. I'm also skeptical of this idea that, what would really make America much more progressive and egalitarian is if we had more third parties, and I just don't see, looking at how Europe is running right now, Europe is in many ways doesn't have the same left-wing voice that America does. I'm not sure that's true. Next question. These are great questions, by the way, and any of these could be like its own episode, so I'm just giving you some off-the-cuff thoughts. I'd be interested in your thoughts of properly identifying political trends, e.g. fascist, versus the value of effective rhetoric, e.g. weird. The prior seems closer to the truth but ineffective. The latter seems marginally true but effective. Which takes priority? Yeah, another absolutely fantastic question here. I've always sort of not got involved directly in the fascist debate of is it appropriate to call Trump fascist? I mean, I'm sure I have in some occasions. I find what that debate is it's kind of a proxy for what I was terming earlier, the alarmist versus the anti-alarmist debate. I think there are people who really feel Trump is an existential threat, and there are people, both on the centre and on the sort of far left, who think we're exaggerating. And that can sort of metamorphise into this debate about, is it historically accurate to term this fascism? I'm not a historian of Nazi Germany, and a lot of the people who get into that debate aren't historians of Nazi Germany. So I don't have a hard position there. I think it's very fair to say that Trump is authoritarian and anti-democratic and anti-liberal and genuinely something to be concerned about. I'll also agree with the sort of implication of that question that has proved to be not particularly effective political rhetoric. We say democracy is on the ballot and people shrug, and I think that's partly a media problem, in that the media just kind of refuses to take that seriously, even after the events surrounding the 2020 election. I also think the electorate is just kind of over it. They don't want to hear about it. It reminds me, in a lot of ways, to someone who, in their heart of hearts, might know that there's something wrong, but if someone says, you should really get your cholesterol checked, should really get that mole is looking a bit gnarly. You should get that checked out. Everything's fine. I don't need to go. I don't want to go to the doctor. He'll get kind of defensive and put it off. In many ways, precisely because they know that there's something wrong. There's that kind of, I don't know if that analogy made sense, but there's that kind of thought pattern, I think, in the electorate of I don't want to think of, stop, this is not nice to think, stop making me think about the thing that's not nice to think about. Now, with coterminous with the switch to Harris, Democrats seem to have really dropped that messaging, and instead they're going with this weird phrasing. Now, this comes from Tim Walz. I was calling him Waltz, but apparently it's Walz, Kamala's new running mate, who I think is a very good pick, incidentally. I like him a lot. Very, very strong track record as governor in Minnesota. He coined this term, and it really caught on, of saying these guys are just Vance, Trump, they're just weird. I don't know that that's marginally true. I think it is true that these are weird people, and that weirdness is politically salient, and I think it's a bit more cutting than than you might be thinking. I think they're not just sort of saying, ha ha, he's a nerd. I don't think that's quite it. I think it has a bit more teeth than that. I'll put it this way. There's different types of weird people. You go to the party, and there's the weird guy who, like, just rambles on about, like, his particular hobbies and doesn't pay any attention to you and is into weird stuff and kind of smells funny. And there's the weird guy who you have to look at of, like, is he going to put something in anyone's drink? Is this guy safe? JD Vance is both of those guys. He's both weird in that he is just, like, off, and that he is interested in things like forcing people to have kids that are not normal obsessions to have. Even among pro-life people, he's weird about it. And he's also weird as in, like, he's dangerous. Like you would get the feeling he's not a guy you would want to leave your kids alone with, right? So I think the weird lands and it bites. And it is a reversal, because, I mean, when I came up in politics, it was like in the George W. Bush era, where, you know, he was a fun guy who pretended to be a cowboy and you'd want to have a beer with him. And, you know, John Kerry and Al Gore were kind of a bit stuffy and boring and, what was the phrase they used about Kerry? French-looking, you know. Whereas now it's completely different. Like, they're the weirdos now. Like, I accept my version of what's weird is probably different to what the median voters is, but I think even from the median voters' perspective, these are weird people. I think Walls put it quite well. You can't see them just coming home from work and, like, petting their dog and giving their belly a good scratch because he's a good boy. Like, they just don't have normal people instincts like that. I think that's completely valid, and I think, you know, I think the reason it lands is, I think these people are fascists and they're a threat to democracy is very apocalyptic, and it's almost paralysing. It makes it such a big problem that it feels like, well, what can we do about it? I think it also feeds in. I think people like Trump want you to be afraid of them. I think his supporters like the fact that liberals are afraid of him. I mean, the other way you can go, that I think also, like, is true, but it doesn't land, is to go, oh, well, that's so offensive, that's so racist, that's so sexist, I'm really offended, that hurts my feelings. I think that's totally true. I think Trump is a racist and he is a sexist. But that liberal outrage is built in. That's a feature, not a bug for them. They like Trump because he offends and upsets liberals. But they really can't handle being called weird. It really gets under their skin in a different way. Okay, so to circle back, like what takes priority? I think, what is your speech for? What are you trying to do, right? Like, are you trying to communicate to the electorate broadly that these are not people to be trusted with power? In which case, I think the weird thing works, and it's sort of functionally true as a way of making that argument. I also think in an election with stakes like this, you sort of say what you need to say, honestly. But, you know, also, like, if you asked me what's personally convincing to me the most, I do find someone like JD Vance aesthetically repulsive. Not like how he looks, but who he is. Like, he's not someone I'd want to be friends with. Not someone I'd want to take for a beer or, like, trust to be left alone with children, you know? But what's really convincing to me is the existential threat to liberal democracy. I'm not just saying that because I'm a Democratic partisan. Like, I think that is true in a way that I would not say that about UK politics, you know? So I think you can separate out those two. You can have different arguments for different occasions. That might be a bit of a Weasley answer, but I think, you know, on a podcast like this, I will spend time on the threat to liberal democracy side. But I'm not running for office, and I accept that there's differences there. Next question. Libertarian movement's tendency to this election. Yeah, I mean, I think true libertarianism of a sort of like socially progressive, economically conservative type is just like 7 people in America hold that view, and all of them are New York Times columnists. Like, and they represent absolutely no electoral constituency on the planet. That's not really even to be against them. I think there's worse things to be. I can sort of appreciate true libertarians. It's not a big chunk of the electorate. I think what you have, and what's a reasonable chunk in America, is the kind of like woozy libertarian, an oddball collection of people who hoard gold and believe in conspiracy theories, or like have this kind of like chunky approach to like what foods they eat, and I only want to drink purified water, or people who are obsessed with like, you know, the moon landings were faked or stuff like that. Um, that's a chunk of the electorate, and they do vote sometimes. And I think, honestly, those votes, almost by their very nature, aren't necessarily available to either of the main political parties. Um, I mean, I sound very dismissive there, but I've met a guy, I knew a guy who was obsessed with hoarding gold because the currency collapse is coming. And not like a rich guy, just like a normal guy who spent all his additional income on buying gold bars, you know, or who get really obsessed with like monetary policy being a plot, or like they're not all one type and believe it's sort of this, like I say, motley crew of different types, and that will often gravitate to libertarian third party candidates. The people I knew who I'm thinking of here, they all voted Gary Johnson in the 2016 election. At the moment, I think they are that is being held down by RFK, and by the way, if you haven't seen the RFK bear thing, the dead bear cub, that is the funniest thing I have seen in so long. Like, people talk about, oh my god, I was crying, laughing. I was actually crying. Yeah, just look that up. Like, it is the weirdest, most darkly funny story. I feel I've got a bit away from the libertarian question, but that sort of section of the electorate is with him right now. I'm not sure that those are votes that would default to Trump. Maybe some of them, or maybe some of them, I think, realistically, just sort of aren't available to either major party, at least as currently constituented. Next question. What does the literature say on moving a party such as Democrats to the left? Do you need existing candidates to move to the left, or do you need public opinion to shift to the left so that more leftist candidates will be elected? Probably a combo, but what's the waiting? Or better said, do politicians move public opinion, or does public opinion move politicians? There's a second part to the question. Let me do this first part first. Does public opinion move politicians, or do politicians move public opinion? Politicians respond to public opinion. More specifically, politicians respond to their stakeholders. So politicians respond specifically to the voters who elect them, which may be different to public opinion as a whole. So most politicians in America, are looking to their particular districts, and maybe even more specifically, the primary electorate within those districts. And they value a lot what those people think. And politicians will generally not take a position that will make it difficult for them to win a primary. They also, stakeholders, I would say, is more broad than that. There's a lot of like mid-level players that they value what the press thinks of them. They'll be either generally or in their specific district like leaders of particular advocacy groups, people who are influential within their communities, people who can, in and of themselves move votes for or against a politician, they will care what they have to say. So it's public opinion both at the broad level, at the level of the particular people who elect them, and the sort of mid-level players who they need to make nice with in order to get their endorsements. That's generally what moves politicians. Politicians impacting public opinion is a bit different. Usually I would say that's less the case. I think with very high polarisation, it is the case that people will default to sort of their party's position. So, I mean, to give an example, with Trump, you're seeing Republicans say it's less and less important that the president has high moral character or isn't involved in scandals. They used to say that was very important under Clinton. Now they say that that's less important. I think with respect to really driving a more policy-specific viewpoint, I think, the so-called bully pulpit or something like that is quite overrated. I think politicians have limited ability to genuinely persuade people who are not already on their side. I think the most politicians can do is people who are already on their side will sort of default to them as a sort of I want to support my team type thing, if that makes sense. I think more usually, I think the question is very much coming from the left-wing perspective. If you want to make politicians more left-wing, sort of changing public opinion, also changing the opinion of specific constituencies, specific stakeholders, sort of effective advocacy from people who speak to blocks of votes. That's what you're looking at. So you could see that very, very clearly on something like gay marriage, which used to be an issue that Democrats were a bit scared of, and then as it sort of approached over 50% support, it was just like the dominoes started falling, and now that it's sort of 60-70% public support for gay marriage, and certainly anyone who's coming out to vote for a Democrat, either in a general or a primary, they all support it. Anyone who is one of these mid-level people who tries to influence Democrats either supports it or doesn't care about it. So now every Democrat supports gay marriage, and that happened quite fast. I think I could talk about a lot of other issues, but that's what you'll see, and that's, I think, that sort of structure and relationship kind of governs the extent to which the sort of mainline Democratic Party picks up ideas from the leftmost fringe. The leftmost fringe has this fight for 15, raise the minimum wage. This is very popular, and everyone whose voice matters to Democrats likes it, so Democrats run on it, and they do it when they're able to in office. Defund the police was not popular and was, a potential vote loser for Democrats, so they don't run on it, And I think that goes to, a broader thing of, if you want to move the Democratic Party to the left, there's kind of the outside and the inside track. The outside track is sort of electing insurgents, your AOCs who primary existing members, and that's totally valid. But the other thing is just changing that incentive structure for the Democratic Party such that the people they answer to, be that their general electorates, their primary electorates, their sort of district-specific electorates, the sort of mid-level players, the advocacy groups, and yes, unfortunately, the press, such that, and the donor class, let's be real, but that those groups are pulling the mainline Democratic Party in a more left-wing direction. And that is actually what's happened, I would say, over the last 8 to 10 years in American politics, is all those groups generally have pulled left, including, by the way, donors. People who give money to the Democratic Party, there's a feeling that, it's people versus big money. A lot of the money Democrats get is actually from people who are more progressive than the centre of the electorate. And you have seen on a number of issues, from the welfare state to Democrats passing this huge, spending the GDP of Italy on a climate bill, which got zero coverage, but I think is hugely important, to taking a more robust antitrust, anti-monopoly position. The Democratic Party has moved left, not because I think they had some come to Jesus moment, but because the core stakeholders that politicians answer to have shifted in favour of that. And that has just changed the incentive structure and it's changed politicians' behaviour. So the second part of the question was, what I was thinking about specifically is it a reasonable strategy for a leftist to withhold votes from a Democrat to influence them leftwards, or should they instead be influencing public opinion to move leftwards? So I think you know what my answer's going to be on this. I think definitely the latter. I think this idea of like you move public opinion, but also public opinion writ large, but also with an eye to what are the specific electorates that politicians are responding to, and also like what are the different groups who are like, an advocacy group for abortion or an advocacy group for gay rights or for whatever. What are the people who are sort of leading those coalitions who have a bit, let's be real, a bit more access to politicians than we do? What are they saying when they get in a room with Democrats? What's the sort of institutional left that has these non-profits and think tanks? Where are they at? What are they saying? Because they're also influenceable. I think that's sort of how you move the party. I think, there are cases where you might want to withhold votes. I don't think contemporary American politics is one of them. I think probably if, I think, and also if you're going to withhold votes, you need to be sensitive of like, are we asking Democrats to do... If you're going to withhold votes for something that's popular, that's one thing. If you're going to withhold votes to ask the Democrats to take a position that might alienate more moderate and swing voters, that's another. And it might very well backfire that the Democrats look at it and think, well, in 2016, we lost about 4 million people to Bernie or bust who voted for Bernie in the primary and didn't vote in the general. We lost 7 to 8 million people who were Obama to Trump voters, who were sort of older, white, without college degrees, socially conservative. And, if we have a choice, we'd rather carry both of those groups. But if we have a choice, we'd rather carry the moderate Obama to Trump voters. Why? Because there's twice as many of them, and they're potential switchers, so they count for twice as much. It's not just us losing a vote, it's a vote going to Republicans. So, and you see that, by the way, like in the UK, where the sort of socialisty left that sort of, was activated in the US under Bernie Sanders, some of which did abstain in 2016, which largely rallied behind Biden in 2020, and now was flirting with another abstention this election, I think have been somewhat mollified by Harris, but we shall see. That section in the UK, at about the same time, they gravitated around a figure called Jeremy Corbyn, who it's a bit unfair to compare to Sanders. Sanders is a much better politician, much better person, I think, than Jeremy Corbyn. And what's happened now is, through a whole complicated story that I'm not going to go through, they have now just crashed out of the Labour Party completely. The Labour Party is run by a very moderate, if not centre-right faction, whose view is those people can go fuck themselves and get out the party, we don't even want their votes. And the view from the sort of Corbynites is equally hostile. Labour is absolutely awful and terrible, and we're going to vote Green. And the Greens did very, very well in the recent election, they also were able to elect a number of candidates on a sort of independent, anti-Israel or sort of pro-Palestine, pro-ceasefire in Gaza sort of platform. Now, that might sound good to you, yeah, like, we shouldn't be like tied to a centrist party. It's good that we're electing a few independents and we got some Green MPs elected and so on. The consequence of that is those left voices are no longer stakeholders in the institutional Labour Party. The institutional Labour Party does not answer to them anymore and is not incentivised to appease them. It knows that those votes are gone, and it's not interested in trying. Indeed, it thinks if it did try, they wouldn't come on board and it would just alienate people at the centre. So what the British Labour Party has done as a consequence is to just abandon those votes and go much more aggressively at getting independents, moderates, and sort of the least conservative flank of the Conservative Party to vote for them. And as a result, the Labour Party has become, I would say on every front, economic and social, much more conservative than the Democrats. Like I was telling someone, like, in the US about how, like, the stated position of the Labour Party going into the last election was that children should not be taught about trans people in schools. Like, that's our Labour Party, our left-wing party position. And you know, their position on the economy is very much that we're going to sort of continue with austerity. We're not going to do big increases to benefits or anything like that. They are at least sort of pro-green, I guess. They're building new solar plants and stuff is good. But you have quite a conservative party in a lot of ways. And that's what you get when the leftmost flank is no longer stakeholders in the party. If those votes aren't available, then we make up for it with votes at the centre instead. And I think that is very much what would happen, you know, if that leftmost flank fell away. The leftmost flank in America is kind of hanging on uneasily. The Democratic Party will try and speak to them, but it has to balance that speaking to them with holding the moderates and centrists and crossover Republicans in place. And it has to do that balance with the knowledge that the sort of moderate swing votery group is larger than the leftmost flank, right? So we have a little leverage there, but not a huge amount, and it is very, very possible to overplay it, and it is very possible for that to backfire and for us actually to make the party much more conservative if we get to the point where the party feels that it simply cannot win those votes, or that it cannot win them without alienating the centre. So what you want to do is push on issues where you have public opinion on your side and in which you can say this is win-win, and where we make progress is with that. Like the minimum wage is a great example. Both people in the centre and people on the far left want this and can get behind that. That's something we can push. In terms of like personnel decisions, I think the Walz pick, the VP pick for Harris, seemed to have that quality too, of he's someone who's sort of very stereotypically male and Midwestern and has a very sort of moderate affect. But the far left really liked him too, because he got a lot of progressive stuff done as governor of Minnesota. So it's not always either or. There are options where both the sort of, you know, because the Democratic Party coalition runs from corporate CEOs to literal Stalinists. You know that is a broad ideological stretch. But there are issues where where both the centremost flank and the leftmost flank actually like something, and that's where you can drive them. Gay marriage is obviously another example. Being sort of pro doing something about the environment is another example. And then, as an example of one that's tricky for the party, you would say, I think clearly the Israel-Gaza thing is tricky for the party. This has become something that the leftmost flank feel very, very strongly about. But I think in the centre of electorate, you're going to have much more varied opinions. And that's why the party is behaving much more cautiously on that issue. Whereas, if American public opinion changed, and it is changing, by the way, I think whatever else you might say about Israel's conduct, it's behaved very, very poorly from a PR point of view. I think they've made themselves look very bad. And if it used to be overwhelmingly the American electorate supported Israel, now I think it's much closer. I think it's much more muddy and undecided. And I think you are seeing politicians' behaviour change a little bit with respect to that. So that was quite a long answer there. I think I've always been pretty consistent that I don't think vote withholding is a great strategy. I think the final thing I'll say on this, and then I'll stop, because this is one. These are all such good questions. I could do a whole episode on any of these. Is with vote withholding, I think people have a habit of saying, well, if we don't do that, what other means of influence do we have? And that always seems to me a bit like people want to withhold their votes and they're sort of working backwards to get to that conclusion, whereas that shouldn't be how you should approach it. You should approach it with, how do we get the party to adopt the best positions and enact the best positions possible? And for many reasons, including the ones I've just said, I don't think vote withholding is a great strategy. And there's much better ones. I think putting primary elections matter and politicians respond to them. I also sort of think these mid-level players, getting in, if there's an issue you care about, what's the organisation that is doing advocacy for that, and can you strengthen them by volunteering or giving money to them? If you care about gay rights, give money to the Human Rights Campaign, volunteer for them, whatever it might be. Changing public opinion, making the argument more broadly, whatever it is that changes that total incentive structure for politicians, So there's any number of things you can do that can move the Democratic Party in a particular direction. Do those. Don't do the thing that we kind of know doesn't work and has a big potential to backfire. Okay, let's leave it there. That was 10 questions, so yeah, let's leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.